The last story ended with me coming face to face with the woman who made my life a living hell at the office. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to come face to face with your bully after so many years? That is the situation I found myself in after many years of successfully avoiding her. Once upon a time, not in a fairy tale but in the real world of the workforce, I was the victim of persistent bullying. My experience with bullying didn't occur in high school. As with most people's experiences, it happened when I was an adult. My boss, Mr. Z, was indeed professional and kind. He was a well-known celebrity, and he owned several businesses. I had started working with and for him during my divorce. The real problem was Mrs. Z, my boss's wife, who for some inexplicable reason chose me as her target. It looked like she was determined to make my life a living hell at every chance she got. For whatever reason, I had to defend my work with her too. It was like working for two people working for her husband on one side of the building wasn't a deterrent. She would cross the building daily, sometimes multiple times, to criticize my work. It was relentless, and my colleagues began to notice too. I said nothing, I needed the job. I was going through a divorce of which nobody was privy to. I was raising two small children, and this was my first job in years. So, I endured the bullying, staying silent and humble. The fear and pressure were constant, every day a test of survival. What would she find to criticize today? Amid all this, I put on a brave face and kept going, dealing with the emotional turmoil. Hence, the added pressure from Mrs. Z's constant criticism became almost unbearable on some days. Some may call it cowardly, I call it being focused. Finally, my divorce was over. Decree absolute. I read the bold-lettered words out loud as my lawyer said congratulations. I was divorced, single again. Life continued, and after gathering some significant savings I quit the job, even though my boss was a decent man. His wife, on the other hand, had turned the workplace into a battlefield, and for the sake of my mental health I had to leave. I moved to another country with my children, vowing to remain resilient and not let their actions break me. After I resigned, the rumors started. I heard Mrs. Z had mentioned she was suspicious I was having an affair with Mr. Z. What? Excuse you? I wept bitterly when I heard the stories. Surely they had to be office gossip. How could she think that? I was always professional. Was that why she'd been so cruel? Heck, I was going through a divorce. How could I do such? I was so disturbed, but I prayed about it and asked God to vindicate me. Little did I know, the winds of change and vindication were about to blow yet again several years later. But they did, and I was on the verge of a new experience that would reinforce God's love for me. He was about to show me that he had heard my cries. Isn't life just filled with unexpected twists and turns? It's like a surprise party that never ends. After relocating, I found myself exploring new schools for my kids. Even though I always emphasized the importance of being streetwise, I also wanted them to appreciate our traditions and customs. We attended a local party shortly thereafter, and it was a new and exciting experience for my children. For me, it was about rekindling my love for authentic food and seeing faces I hadn't met in years. While my kids were busy exploring, I was approached by a familiar voice. It was Mrs. Z, my office-place tormentor from the past. Suddenly, the music became a distant murmur, the crowd's laughter a faint echo. Memories of bullying and humiliation came back, and my heart skipped a beat. Not just because she recognized me after so many years, but because of the emotions that I thought I had left behind. I agreed to talk to her privately, mentally preparing myself to finally stand up to her if she tried to bully me again. As she walked ahead of me, I found myself wondering about her life, about Mr. Z, and most importantly, what she wanted from me. Old tales of her wild accusations came back to me, and I felt an array of raw emotions. But this time I was ready to defend myself, ready to show her that I was not the same person anymore. As she began to speak, she caught me off guard. "I'm so sorry for how I treated you so many years ago. I was barking up the wrong tree. Please forgive me and accept my apology." It took a moment for it to sink in. Just like that, life surprised me again. God showed up and showed out for me like he always does. And in that moment, I realized that the sweetest revenge wasn't retaliation, it was personal transformation. I stood there as nothing sank in. I was in a daze. And then, finally when it did, I was completely taken aback. I just gazed at this woman, a figure from my past who had once brought unhappiness into my life. Suddenly, I didn't see the tormentor I once knew, but a shattered woman, a mirror of what she had passed through, and that moment transformed us both. She seemed so ordinary and broken. The shock was immediate, like an icy wave washing over me. I wanted to react with spite. Hit them when they are vulnerable, right? Wrong. I couldn't. I saw this as a divine intervention, a sign that my past struggles and tears had not been in vain. As I stood there, locked in a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, my heart began to soften. In a voice filled with understanding, I replied, "It is all forgiven." The woman who had the power to stoke fear in me was now standing there asking for my forgiveness. The memories, stories, and emotions from the past came flooding back. But I also started to realize something. I had grown, evolved, and transformed. This was a confrontation I had not anticipated, yet it revealed the strength I had gathered over the years. I was still in a daze as I returned to my sit. I reminded myself that she no longer had any hold over me. Her dominance was a thing of the past. The fear she once instilled in me was replaced by a sense of empowerment. She was no longer the imposing figure from my past, but an ordinary woman, just like anyone else. Despite the emotional turmoil, I decided to stay, refusing to let the past dictate my actions. As the initial shock faded away, I joined my friends on the dance floor, keeping an eye on my kids as they enjoyed themselves. The incident had changed my perspective, reinforcing my belief in my personal growth and resilience. Most importantly, my belief in God. As we drove home, my older sister, who of course had knowledge of my work experience, asked what the discussion was about. When I narrated it to her, she too was shocked. I smiled as I am continuously reminded of the love of God, of His vindication and support. All that had transpired was so bizarre I had to keep reminding myself it did happen. The sincerity in her voice was surprising, and it made me wonder what battles she had fought all those years I didn't see her. An unexpected wave of calm washed over me. This was not a moment I had anticipated, but it was one that brought healing and closure. The bully had apologized and in doing so had revealed her own vulnerabilities. This was a show of personal growth and reconciliation. Suddenly I was no longer a victim but a survivor. And with that I closed my eyes and fell asleep. For the next few days, as I went about my life, I found myself lost deep in my thoughts. It's surprising how sometimes the ones we least expect to acknowledge us become the ones who do so. Crazy. I had so many questions as I played our conversation over and over and over in my head. That sentence, "I was barking up the wrong tree," was extremely revealing. In yet another display of God's timely intervention, the mystery of Mrs. Z's statement, "I was barking up the wrong tree," finally made sense to me. As I was going through my divorce, Mrs. Z was grasping at straws trying to save hers. The realization dawned on me. Mrs. Z's celebrity husband, Mr. Z, was entangled in an extramarital affair. She knew this for a fact. She suspected it was at the office. Desperate to identify the woman, she had targeted me, the new kid on the block, without any substantial evidence. This closure was bittersweet. Mrs. Z had apologized, but the whole situation left me questioning the integrity of people. Despite the turmoil, I felt a sense of closure. The storm had finally passed. As I navigated the tumultuous waters of my divorce, I found myself an unwitting in another woman's desperate attempt to save her own marriage. Mrs. Z, a woman of influence and power, was lashing out at me, the new staff member, misguidedly seeing me as a threat. Each of us was dealing with very similar marital issues, but our approaches were diametrically opposed. She took it to the gutters. I refrained from stooping low, never once acknowledging the other woman in my life, focusing solely on my ex-husband and my own healing process. This showed clearly how we as humans all deal with betrayal and pain in such varying ranges of the emotional spectrum. Obviously, she must have found out eventually who the perpetrator was, hence her need to apologize to me. She recognized that she had mistreated me for no just cause, and the wicked irony of it all was what I was secretly been dealing with the same time. During that unexpected encounter, I saw a transformation in Mrs. Z. She admitted her mistakes and asked for my forgiveness. Not many people would admit to their crime, let alone apologize for it. In her honesty, I found mirrored my own growth. Her apology didn't erase the past, but it did offer a sense of closure, helping me to turn the page on that chapter of my life. I felt a wave of relief wash me, and gratitude warmed my heart. In facing our hardships, we had both learned valuable lessons about forgiveness, self-love, and the importance of happiness. This journey, as painful as it was, proved to be a stark reminder of the divine protection I am blessed with. Now, with a heart full of gratitude and a soul that's found peace, I pose to you a question. How would you react if you were to come face to face with a bully from your past?